You're listening to Faithless Brewing, a Magic the Gathering podcast for the Spike Rogue. Each week we design decks for tournament play. We put our creation to the test and share our findings on the air. Today we ask the question, what is a battle? And present brews with Invasion of Gobakhan. Then on the Flashback we'll be looking at Omen Hawker and Training Grounds. Should the Omen Hawker be heading to Wall Street or maybe just right back to the Sally Ann where we found him? Find out today on Faithless Brewing.
Hello and welcome to the Faithless Brewing podcast. I'm your host, Dan Schriever, also known as Cave Dan, and I'm joined once again by my man from up in the burning lands of Canada, the hero of the Invasion of Gobakhan. It's Zach Menacemble Ryle.
It me. Yeah, it's weird that our country is like literally on fire in a bunch of places, but then where I'm at, it's just been cool. Like, it has not been able to get over 22 degrees Celsius, or that's like 75 freedom units on any day, which is fine by me. It's great weather for biking or going for a run, or you can hang out in my favorite outfit, as I'm wearing now, jeans and a t-shirt.
Well, I'm glad that these apocalyptic wildfires are working out so well for you. Maybe it's because you sent all the smoke down into the United States. Our air quality index has been unbelievable.
Yeah, we had a big cloud here in and around Toronto about a week ago for a couple of days, and then it went away. It was actually kind of pleasant. It smelled like, campfire was going on a couple doors over, when in fact it was a cataclysmic result of man-made climate change. How you doing, Dan?
That's fine. No, my aging father, blessed be his health, is sending me pictures of he can't even go outside because your cloud that just went away is now over his house. It's literally over his house.
Yeah, that'll happen. My cloud.
It's like smoking 5 cigars a day. It's terrible.
What is that? That's like 25 cigarettes at once. Well, besides the apocalyptic climate news, we've got some exciting things to talk about. We've got a new brew around, build around card. We've got some old news to wrap up and talk about some of the testing we did on some of the decks that we worked on in the last couple weeks. We've got a little bit away from us, but that happens every now and then during preview season. So hopefully people are still excited to hear about these results. And a new set being released into the modern format comes out later this week, which is just bonkers to me. But the Lord of the Rings set is coming, but it doesn't affect Pioneer, and a lot of the things that we are talking about are Pioneer exclusive. So that's kind of a nice way for that all to line up.
Yeah, exactly. I think we'll have a classic Faithless Brewing episode here. New cards, some new decks, courtesy of David Robertson, our resident Pioneer brewmaster, and then some testing results. Zach, I know you went deep into Omen Hawker and Training Grounds. And then, our next show will flip back to Modern. I think we've got some ideas already kicking around for Lord of the Rings. And if you want to hear more of that, you can go back and listen to our set review where myself, Zach, Emmy went in great detail about many of these hobbits and ents and ring wraiths and such.
Better detail than some professionals out there. I saw one streamer that I won't name burying his face in his hands and over again saying, "I don't believe it. I thought this card said only when your opponent casts 2 or their second spell each turn." Of course, alluding to the Ledger Shredder-esque legendary hobbit we were talking about last time.
Yes.
Who I don't
Who can forget Lotho the Corrupt?
Lotho, there we go, Lotho.
And his beloved Stone of Erech.
Yes, absolutely. So go check out our thoughts on that. And if you want to see all the detailed notes, well, you can do that if you're a member of our Patreon, which you can join for as little as $1 a month, I believe, which gives you Discord access to our show notes, and you get to be in one of the best brewing communities I've ever seen in the wonderful wide world of the internet.
We do have one new patron we would like to welcome this week. That is Kendrew M. Thank you very, very much for your support. Kendrew is a crab vine enthusiast, so as a fellow crab vine enjoyer, I say welcome. Welcome to the fold.
I do own Vengevines. I haven't used them yet, but I bought them in concert with the Ledger Shredders that I was using the other week playing Pioneer Drakes. Someday I'll eventually put a Vengevine into play. I'm sure it'll happen eventually. In fact, there was a really interesting interaction that we'll get to when we get over to Lord of the Rings cards that makes me kind of excited to revisit some kind of Hollowvine deck.
Oh, yes. All right, so that's going to be coming up. Today, Pioneer, talking about Invasion of Gobakhan. Zach, what is this card? And what is Gobakhan?
What's a battle? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said, what's that rattle? No, Invasion of Gobakhan is, in fact, a battle. It's a battle with the subtype Siege. We don't know what other subtypes that battles might have someday, but that's all right. All of the ones in March of the Machines are Sieges so far. So it's 1 and a white for a battle. When it enters the battlefield, you look at target opponent's hand. You may exile a non-land card from it for as long as that card remains exiled. Its owner may play it. A spell cast this way costs 2 more to cast. So you get kind of a little bit of a Thoughtseize-esque thing, but with the white mechanic that just means, yes, they can cast it eventually, but it's going to cost them 2 extra. And this battle has 3... battle counters, damage, loyalty. I don't know what these are. But if
defense.
Yeah, it's defense.
That's a defense.
Okay, it's defense. So it's three defense, and it flips into Light Shield Array. So this is an enchantment that says at the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that attacked this turn. It also has an activated ability that says sacrifice a Light Shield Array. Creatures you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So that is a hell of a kind of Anthem-esque effect that can also have like a Selfless Spirit effect. So that is wonderfully powerful once you flip it. And the front side, of course, has that kind of I don't know what's a colloquial term for this. The LSV Invitational card has this ability.
The PVDDR Invitational.
Oh, Palo, that's right. Sorry, LSV and PVDDR, I get them mixed up because they both have names that get collapsed down into acronyms for some reason.
I don't think LSV has a card yet.
No, probably not. He hasn't been the world champion since they started doing that again. Anywho, Invasion of Gobakhan, apparently, unbeknownst to me, had a sort of controversial little period of time. Let's see, it was in between the 21st and 28th of May. Now, I'm going to go ahead and cast my mind back through the mists of time towards that weekend and the week preceding that, because I believe it was the weekend of like June 2nd, around there. That was when the Canadian RC happened. There was a lot of big Pioneer events happening at that time. The weeks preceding that is when this card spiked like crazy, and that was the same time that Boros Convoke deck was the new hotness in Pioneer. People were losing their minds. They were saying this is going to be, it requires bannings. There's no possible way to beat this. Oh, can you believe that they put 14 power into play on turn 2? I think we covered that in depth, and it felt like an overreaction at the time, and it has proved to be such. And the only thing that's really worthy of note is that there was a lot of back and forth between some very well-informed players on these archetypes about whether this card was the most important card in many of your matchups or it was completely unplayable. People like to be divisive, especially when, the court of public opinion gets so distracted that it doesn't matter if your take was right or wrong. People probably won't even remember which side you were on as long as you took a side.
So looking at the price chart, this is currently one of the most expensive regular rares from March of the Machine. It started off as like a $2 or $3 bulk card, went up to $5, and then it spiked all the way up to $20 during this those heady days in mid-May. It's come back down now to around $9 or $10, but that's still extremely expensive for a card that, as we'll see, is actually quite controversial. I'm looking at a tweet here from Andrew Ellenbogen, Pro Tour champion, from June 5th. He says, PSA, Invasion of Gobakhan is not playable in Pioneer in any known deck. Thank you for your time. then in the replies, many replies come in and say, no, it's been so good for me in these scenarios or this deck, spirits or whatever was a sideboard card. People have been interested in this.
Yeah, having done the research today, there's an unbelievable number of, I would say, results that you can get on a Goldfish search of people who put this into their mono white humans decks, or just any kind of semi-aggressive creature-based deck that you're going to play in the Pioneer format. And the thing is, it's just very, very loud because there were so many regional championships and similar events where every single deck list was released. So sorting through it to see of the top percentage of those decks, which ones are or are not playing this, that is not a level of depth that I went into. But suffice to say that I think it's probably fine. I've seen it in main decks. I've seen it in sideboards. I've been beaten to hell by it. So it's certainly not unplayable. The level of playability to which you can, expect it to pay you back, I don't know that, because I can imagine some nightmare situations where you draw like 2 of this and not enough threats, right? Or something of that nature. So
yeah, exactly. So we've got 3 new decks that David Robertson has prepared for us. But before we dive into them, let's just make sure we understand exactly what's going on with the card and what we should be thinking about as we're exploring places that we might brew with it. Mm-hmm. So in terms of rules, Zach, I think you'd agree it's fairly straightforward. It's actually the exact same text on the front side as Elite Spellbinder.
Yep.
A mini Thoughtseize, but only for non-land cards. That card then can be played for 2 more mana. The backside. So this is actually one of the cheaper battles to defeat. Very few can be defeated with just 3 damage. The backside is actually fairly small, right? It adds counters to each creature that attacked this turn. That happens on the end step. It does not matter what the creature's attacked. So if you're envisioning that you're like a weenie deck with, 3 or 4 creatures, you can just send 1 creature to flip the Invasion of Gobakhan. All of them will get a +1/+1 counter, so that's very nice. And the backside is not a creature. That's kind of the biggest thing. So it doesn't really snowball in the same way that most of the battles do, right? You don't add another piece to your attacking force. Instead, you add like this defensive tool that distributes some amount of +1/+1 counters, but it's unclear to me how much that's worth.
I've seen it being a lot. Especially because like the mono white humans deck or the Boros deck tend to go very, very wide, very fast, either with Adeline or other cards that create a bunch of tokens. And having the ability to insulate your side from the sweeper that you may have put into exile on the front side and delayed, it kind of like teams up to be this very powerful 1-2 punch of preventing your opponent from kind of getting on their feet or just using a single card to 3 or 4 for 1 you. And these decks have their own ways of generating card advantage, so this kind of lets you keep up with what might be otherwise more difficult or simplistic matchups, right?
Yeah, would it be fair to say that every battle is asking you to invest time and resources into defeating it? Invasion of Gobakhan protects your investment. The thing that you get is actually a protection for the time you spent.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's a great way to say that. In that, you get something out of this, but the something you get is both 1, not easy to interact with as an enchantment, and 2, makes interacting with your other stuff more difficult. The fact that you put in time to kill the invasion, in some cases it's like, oh, but you're giving them time to then deal with you, and it's like, well, actually this kind of solves that problem for you in that they can't just follow up with a Wrath of God or something like that.
So what are the problems? Well, the front side to me is a problem. If we're comparing it to Elite Spellbinder, we see that for just 1 more mana, you can get a whole 3/1 flyer attached to this effect. So you're not getting anything close to a card out of the front side of the invasion. You can talk yourself into it being mana neutral, like you spend 2 and then their card will eventually cost 2 more. But, well, A, first of all, that's not card neutral. You're down a card for that. And B, you spent that mana now on an important turn. They don't have to spend their mana until later, right? The tax doesn't have to be paid until they're ready to do it. So it's not like a great turn to play to just add the Invasion of Gobakhan to the board, and then your opponent is under no pressure now. They can spend their mana on whatever else they want. It's a different story if the card that you take is actually the one card they were hoping to play that turn, and that's kind of the swinginess of the Elite Spellbinder effect.
Mm-hmm.
It can interrupt their curve, or it can just put you behind. You invested something hoping it would slow them down, and it actually didn't.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of situations where you're going to play this, and then they're going to have 2 copies of the thing they wanted to play, and it's like, oh, well, cool.
Exactly. So I think that we're not really excited about this until we flip it. When we flip it, how much is that backside worth? Well, the Light Shield Array can trade 1-for-1 with spot removal. It can really protect you from a sweeper. And then there's a question of how much are those counters worth? Do we need that to be an important contribution of the card, or is that just a bonus? Or is that like a key engine? Are we actually going to build around synergies with the +1/+1 counters? And we'll see there are different ways you can answer that based on the kind of deck you're trying to build. I guess the final question would be like, what is the shape of the deck going to be? Are we thinking of this as something that supports our go wide aggro strategy? Thinking of the backside Light Shield Array protecting a bunch of creatures at once from a sweeper, or do we actually want to protect just one big creature? So one thing that came up in Standard when this card was spiking was the specific combination of Ojutai and what's Ojutai's friend? Ojutai's friend.
Zurgo and Ojutai.
So that has a powerful trigger. It's a very powerful singular threat, and there was some maybe tongue-in-cheek discussion of like, oh, this is the new Splinter Twin combo, the Invasion of Gobakhan plus Zurgo and Ojutai. Right? Like, how can they ever stop this? I've landed my dragon, and I've protected the dragon, and the dragon just puts me ahead more and more every turn. So if we're thinking that works in Standard, maybe that also works in Pioneer. Just find one really important threat that can be the same threat that flips the invasion, like a Mantis Rider would be a suggestion. And then you just ride that one threat to victory with the Light Shield Array protecting it.
It doesn't really interest me in the aggregate, if only because I just don't like the idea of that trigger that adds counters being applied to only one thing. It really feels like the more bodies, the better you get. But there are exceptions like Velomachus Lorehold, where adding to its power is giving you a very real upgrade in the ability of that card to, have its own effect. Anything with double strike, obviously, is going to be very, very powerful with that. So I can't think of anything off the top of my head that would be a great thing to play with that. But just playing this with like Fury would be obviously obscene. Not that you need that to be any better than it already is, but.
How can we make Fury a little bit bigger? Many brewers ask this question.
Yeah. Now, that said, we do have the interesting synergy of processors, and I know we're going to get into one of those deck lists. So this puts it in exile, which is a very specific interaction, which a whole bunch of cards get to take advantage of.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe that's a perfect segue into what some of these lists might look like. So we're going to start with Pioneer. We've got 3 deck lists here. These are from the mind of David Robertson. So we'll start off with red-white Shatterskull Charger. Shatterskull Charger. Zach, tell me about this card and tell me how the invasion fits into a deck here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually had to look this one up because I certainly did not specifically or quickly remember what it does. So we've got 1 red, for a 4/3 creature giant warrior. It's got a kicker of 2. It's got trample and haste. If it was kicked, it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. And at the beginning of your end step, if it doesn't have a +1/+1 counter on it, return it to its owner's hand. So what we're doing here is taking advantage of the way that Shatterskull Charger, this Vioshino Sand Slasher, I believe I compared it to when we were talking about it during spoiler season. How this interacts with our invasion. So what we're going to be able to do is play the invasion on 2, play the charger on 3 without its kicker cost, but it has trample and haste at 4/3 body. So assuming that they have maximum 1 toughness to block this with, we get to attack and flip our Invasion of Gobakhan, and then it's going to trigger on end step, putting the counter on it. However, then while this trigger is going to still trigger, which I think it wouldn't do normally. When the trigger resolves, it's going to see that there is a +1/+1 counter on the charger and not return it to your hand.
Yeah, exactly. You do have to stack them correctly.
Yeah.
But if you do that, you will not have to return the charger. You will get to keep your 5/4 trample haste.
The joy of the intervening if clause. So the question is, what do we team up with this for the rest of this deck? And there's some very interesting choices here that can synergize with this in a couple of different ways. One of them is Kumano faces Kakazan, which besides being a 1-drop flips into an attacking 2-drop on your third turn. So you can play it on turn 1, play the invasion on 2, and then on the third turn you're attacking with this, which is not enough solely to flip the Invasion of Gobakhan, but it certainly is going to help. Then we've got Phoenix Chick, which can team up with it. It's a 1/1 flying haste. We've got a couple of Play With Fires, the best shock in the format. We have Luminarch Aspirant, which can add counters to things during combat. Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, which of course generally just good. And then there's a legend here, which I can't quite read. What is this red-white legend?
That is Baird, Argivian Recruiter, red-white for a 2/2 human. At the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power greater than its base power, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. So Baird, very similar to Shatterskull Charger, really wants to be surrounded with pieces that distribute the +1/+1 counters. And Zach already mentioned 3 of them. He mentioned the Luminarch Aspirant, the Invasion of Gobakhan, and Kumano faces Kakazan. If you time that right, the second chapter will give you a counter. So that's where we're hoping to find the critical mass of +1/+1 counters.
Yeah, Kumano into Baird immediately gives you a 1/1 token, and you're going to do that every single turn from that point on, because your Baird has a +1/+1 counter. And we've also got some Brutal Cathars and some Voldaren Thrillseeker. Voldaren Thrillseeker seems really fun with Shatterskull Charger, picking up counters over and over and over again off your invasion, perhaps, having trample the entire time. And then you can do that combo that you see out of like the red-green vehicles deck where you've got maybe a 5/5 Shatterskull Charger. You throw an extra 2 counters on it by playing Voldaren Thrillseeker, attack for 7, and then dome them for 7, which is just a great way to finish a game of Pioneer.
Yeah, Thrillseeker is a new addition to this deck. I think when David originally envisioned it during spoiler season, he had Thundering Raiju in that spot, which is a 4-drop. Decent card in Standard, but not really proven. Thrillseeker, to me, feels like higher ceiling. It's going to play differently, obviously. It's a little bit more of a tricksy attrition card, but
like a hobbit.
Tricksy little hobbit, yes. But it can do a lot of stuff with those counters. I mean, the backup is such an underexplored mechanic. I think Thrillseeker is an underexplored card in general. So just combining it with different creatures that care about +1/+1 counters, I think is going to be really interesting to explore. Like putting those counters onto a Phoenix Chick, for example. That now gives you that 3-power flyer with evasion that flips your invasion. Your evasion flips invasion.
Yeah. Evasion,
Kakazan goes to Gobakhan.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the Phoenix Chick, they're going to try to kill that, so that's where the coming back from the graveyard comes into play, right? It really... It's loose synergies. Like you can envision exactly how the opponent's going to attack this, right? They're going to try to defang your Luminarch Aspirants and such by just destroying your other creatures, so you have nowhere to put your counters. And that's where the Phoenix Chick coming back makes a big difference. That's where Invasion of Gobakhan protecting your guys makes a big difference.
Even Thalia just slowing down their removal spells, but not herself being the most significant threat on most boards is always a great boon for these decks. It's also possible we could play the that white 1-drop with training that picks up counters all along the way. Hopeful Initiate? That's not right, but something like that.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, Hopeful Initiate.
Oh, is that right?
Interesting
Okay.
idea.
Yeah. It is just a very playable card that also allows you to have main deck artifact enchantment removal that makes use of the counters as a resource. Not saying we necessarily need to play it here, but it's just a good option to have. Maybe as a sideboard choice or something. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. So my concern with this deck is just that this red-white, aggro mid-range is definitely just uncharted waters. We just don't see decks like this succeed. Right. I think one of the biggest reasons is that there's no card draw to speak of. You kind of just need to have a good distribution of lands and spells. Your creatures synergize with each other, but that also means that as each one gets picked off by stomps and fatal pushes, they just get comparatively weaker. So that's going to be the challenge, I think, for a deck like this. Like when you're actually facing removal, can you successfully get to critical mass of synergies? And the hope is that both sides of the invasion will get us there, both disrupting their hand, slowing down that removal, and then protecting our key threats once we flip them.
Well, spinning off the same theme, we'll hop over the black-white processor deck for just a second, I think, because I think it's important to stay in this same kind of red-white space. We'll hit these next two, because we've got this red-white Pia Nalaar deck that is really interesting to look at, and then somehow is only playing one copy of Shrapnel Blast, which when I see a card like that, I'm like, And for this deck, I feel like you'd want 3 or 4 because we're just looking to kill people. So this is a lot more aggressive. This is the kind of red deck. So once upon a time in Pioneer, we had like 3 different levels of red decks. We had the big chonky red. We had the slim fast red, as I liked to refer to it, as it was funny to counterpoint chonky with slim fast because it's smaller and faster. And then there was like a middle red deck that had like chain whirlers, but that was like the height of the curve. This is a lot more that bottom of the curve, very aggressive, full of burn spells, more similar to what you'd see in Modern. But this version is playing Pia Nalaar, Council of Revival. So for red-white, you get a 2/3 legendary creature, Human Artificer. Thopters you control have haste. Whenever you play a land from exile or cast a spell from exile, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. And the question is, how many cards do we think that we can regularly cast from exile? In this deck, we've got 3 Light Up the Stage, 4 copies of Ren's Resolve, 4 copies of Reckless Impulse, and 4 copies of Experimental Synthesizer. I know you wanted to read that card, but I thought I'd just grab it for you. So, that's teaming up with a bunch of burn spells in the form of Play with Fire, Voltage Surge, and 1 copy of Shrapnel Blast to kind of clear the way or maybe close out your opponent. And we've also got Monastery Swift Spear, Soul Scar Mage, Kumano Faces Kakazan, so that kind of like red prowess burn core. And then 2 copies of Invasion of Gobakhan here. So this is like not as wide as like the intentionally wide token decks, right? But Pia Nalaar on her own, I mean, I can envision turns where you play 2 or 3 cards from exile. Especially the fact that she triggers off of lands is like A++. And she does not herself have haste, but Monastery Swift Spear does. And I guess I flipped Kumano Faces Kakazan comes in with haste. This one is like, it's neat to look at. I have no idea how good or how well any of this comes together. But there is someone who does. ConnorMan11, he plays aggro. And he had a very similar-ish deck. There's a little bit less nonsense, I would say, but that he managed to pick up a trophy with, and it had sideboard Invasion of Gobakhans. So you can see the tweet is embedded here in the show notes. And if you want good aggro decks, especially in the Pioneer format, always check out what ConnorMan11 is working on because he loves it.
So you may be wondering, what does Invasion of Gobakhan have to do with this Pia Nalaar strategy? Well, the first thing it does is it protects Pia. Pia is by far the most important creature. We're playing all of these Reckless Impulse, Ren's Resolves, Light Up the Stage cards just to really go off with her. But a soft synergy that I didn't even think of until David pointed it out is that when you defeat a battle, what happens? You flip it, right? Well, not exactly. It's not quite a flip. You actually exile it, and then you cast it from exile for free. And casting from exile is exactly what Pia is looking for. So defeating the battle, winning the Battle of Gobakhan, gives you a bonus Thopter when Pia is in play. So it actually is part of that Pia synergy package. Kumano Faces Kakazan, unfortunately, does not work. Right? That one just transforms. Right? It exiles and comes back, transforms, but it is not actually cast. So that will not trigger Pia. In terms of the differences between David's deck and ConnorMan's deck, yeah, I think you hit it on the head, Zach. Just a little bit less nonsense, and specifically its experimental synth. Like this is the crux of it, right? David is thinking the synth does everything that Pia wants. It's cheap. This deck is cheap. It's like too good not to play. And once you've decided that, then it kind of makes sense to play, 2 Voltage Surge and that 1 Shrapnel Blast. For me, that's like a little bit too many conditional cards. Like,
right.
if I'm playing a bunch of Ren's Resolves and Reckless Impulses, I want to make sure that the vast majority of my deck can be played on any board state. And for that reason, I'm like very happy about Play with Fire, less happy about Shrapnel Blast and Voltage Surge.
I'm always happy about Shrapnel Blast just because on raw power it's obscene. I do wonder if we could get like maybe some more like, I don't know, Bomat Courier in here somewhere, or like just more artifacts. I know obviously there's not too many that are worth playing in the Pioneer format, but Shrapnel Blast just on rate is an obscene amount of damage. It closes games so fast. It's not funny. So that's always a card I'm looking to play. But I feel the same way you do about Voltage Surge. It's just not my kind of card. I can't.
I'm not as convinced that Shrapnel Blast is proven to be good. I think times have passed that card by. Like,
sure.
Compared to Tribal Flames is not like a modern staple or anything. It's like some decks can afford to do that, some can't. I almost feel like if you don't actively want to sacrifice the artifacts, then you just can't even consider Shrapnel Blast.
Sure.
And
but
only Experimental Synth clears that bar here.
I guess so. Having a 2-mana 5 burn spell, though, when most of what you're throwing into it is like Thopters and synthesizers, doesn't feel too bad to me. Anyway.
Yeah, it's not so much that. It's just like I'm envisioning that my primary thing I'm going to spend my mana on every turn is these Exile 2 and play them cards.
Yeah.
And that really means that whatever those find, that becomes my priority for the turn.
Sure,
like,
absolutely.
Whatever those flip, I just like want to cast them.
Right, and Shrapnel Blast, even just being 2 mana, all of a sudden is a downside there, because this is going to be, every turn you I mean, this is 19 untapped land deck, so you really want to make sure that you're not running into problems where it's like, oh, I hit like too many Pia Nalaars and other things that I can't cast here.
One card I do want to note is in the sideboard of both David's and Connorman's deck is Showdown of the Skulls, and David actually put this in the sideboard also of the Shatter Skull Charger deck. This is often the answer to, well, what do I do against Rakdos, right? They're going to grind me down. What do I do? Showdown of the Skulls. It's a great little card. It happens to synergize with both Pia and with Shatter Skull Charger, right? Pia will give you Thopters for playing things from exile. The Shatter Skull Charger can pick up a counter, perhaps, from the Showdown, so it's a nice little card. I would even consider going main deck with it if I really felt strongly about, needing to grind, but I think it's safe to start in the sideboard.
And finally, we've got our processors. So
indeed.
I did see at least one Jorian Invasion of Gobakhan deck, so that lets us take advantage of the flickering trigger that Jorian pulls off when it comes into play. However, this is a 60-card deck that's playing a main deck Jorian. So what are we doing here?
All right, so the key card here is Soul Partition.
Are you sure? Are you sure it's not Demonic Pact?
Well, okay, so there's 4 Demonic Pacts. Let's just get that out there first. But why can we even consider Demonic Pact? It's because of Soul Partition. Soul Partition is 1 and a white, instant, exile target non-land permanent. For as long as that card remains exiled, its owner may play it. A spell cast by an opponent this way costs 2 more to cast. Now that's very tricky here, right? So if you use this to exile their thing, it taxes them. But if you use it to blink your own thing, it does not tax you, right? You get favorable trade deals with whatever the Soul Partition is. So it does double duty, right? It can be your removal, or it can be your reset button on the Demonic Pact. Mm-hmm. It can also reset something like a Wasteland Strangler. That's interesting. So Wasteland Strangler, that's that processor. It's like a fine 2-for-1 eventually, but if you're being really clever about it, if you're using a card like Elite Spellbinder, like Invasion of Gobakhan, or like Soul Partition, if you process one of their cards in exile that was actually supposed to come back to the battlefield, you're getting like a 3-for-1 now off your Wasteland Strangler. Is that right? You killed like 2 of their creatures, and you have a 3/2 left over.
Yep, absolutely.
So that's really what this deck is trying to do. Like that's the plays that make this deck feel like, ooh, hey, that's powerful, that's cool. The rest of the cards here are just supporting role, right? Like you have Thoughtseize Push. I see Vanishing Verse here. Temporary Lockdown. There's a single Rite of Oblivion. You do need these these get out of Demonic Pact clauses. So the Rite of Oblivion can be that, sacrificing the pact. I believe Vanishing Verse can also target your own pact in a pinch.
I assume so, but it is one of those modern... Yes, it can.
Okay, so yeah, when it's time to...
There's lots of ways to deal with your Demonic Pact killing you.
Exactly. And then, you do have to kill them eventually, so there's a Wandering Emperor, a Jorian, and a couple Graveyard Trespassers.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like this is within the realm of black-white mid-range decks that have been playable in the modern format. These are always fun. These kind of deck lists, I always have a really good time playing with Demonic Pact, and it's kind of like it's like that fun, challenging level of combo deck where when you do beat your opponent with it, I feel like nobody's ever really been that frustrated or upset by losing to Demonic Pact. It's just so slow and fair. This isn't trying to get anything cute where we donate it. It's just using the power of this 4-mana enchantment that gives you a lot of value over the couple turns and then just resetting it over and over again.
Exactly. And I think that's fairly clever. What's going to hold this deck back is you only get to play 4 copies of Wasteland Strangler, and there really isn't a second processor that we can feel good about. You know, if we knew we would have access every game to Wasteland Strangler, then we could really feel good every time we draw a Soul Partition or draw an Invasion of Gobakhan. There's Elite Spellbinders here on the sideboard. Without that, I'm like, man, I hope I draw the Strangler, but if not, I'm just, just buying time with the Soul Partition or maybe blinking my own thing.
Yeah, if you wanted to add blue, you can play the counter Eldrazi, but it does require 2 things to be in exile, and that's a very different ask than everything in this deck is doing. So that's like, to me, in my mind, that's like the next best playable one of these processors, and it really is a very different card because 2 things in exile is much more taxing. It's a little bit more difficult to guarantee you'll have that.
Yeah, I guess temporary lockdown is the only card that can really exile a bunch of stuff at once.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's 3 different looks at the Invasion of Gobakhan. I think none of these are what the designers of the Invasion had in mind. I think it's one of those cards that it's priced to just be a supporting player in aggressive decks, and you can definitely find decks like that, like mono white humans or something, or Boros Convoke.
Yep.
But I think as a brewing exercise, trying to see what unique properties does the Invasion bring to the table, I think these are the 3 directions I would explore.
And as an aside, I mean, that to me is the heart and soul of what David likes about Pioneer is it exists in a way that Modern used to, in that nothing is designed to be put together in this way. You just look at what cards are in the format and you go, how can we possibly combine these in ways that they were never meant to go together, right? It's not just the best of standards that have happened. It's like, oh, well, this card from this set like 8 years ago and this card from this new set team up in unexpected ways.
Well said.
Yeah. Also, to cover a point that we skipped over at the most appropriate time, what the hell is Gobakhan? Gobakhan is the plane where Teo the Shield Mage came from, who was one of the protagonists of the War of the Spark novel, which I have sitting next to me. It is one of the worst books I've ever read, but Teo's role is to be a character who's pulled from a plane. It was his very first planeswalk is into the War of the Spark, and so he serves as the audience because everyone has to explain everything about everything to this character all the time because he's brand new. So it doesn't feel tedious to the audience. Nobody's asking the question, why did they explain? Like, why is it all exposition with this character? It's like, well, because he's new. This is you. This is you, audience.
Who the hell is that? Like, oh, he's from Gobakhan.
Yeah,
like,
exactly. And this is his first ever planeswalk, and he doesn't, so the only things we know about Gobakhan from the little bits that were in that story is that it is mostly sand, as far as we saw, and that there's an order of shield mage monks, and that we see them here on Invasion of Gobakhan creating the light shield array.
Pretty sure that Lotho the Corrupt Sheriff spent a lot of time on Gobakhan.
You think so?
If I have my lore correct. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I'm sure it has something to do with that, and Saruman of the Many Colors, and the invasion of the Shire. Anywho, we got some flashing back to do.
Exactly. So it's nice to theory craft, but we do have to put these to the test. Test our decks live in the MTGO queues and see what happens. So our most recent brewing card was a doubleheader. It was Training Grounds plus Omen Hawker. 2 cards that they're like driving side by side. They don't work together quite as well as we had hoped, and I think if I'm looking at these results accurately, I think they each had more success alone than they did together.
Yeah, I would say the number one shell, and I commented on it somewhere in my notes. The number one shell where these things came together, I played a couple of Blue Devotion decks, and it was incredibly good to have both of them in there. I think the most powerful thing you can do with Omen Hawker in general is activate Nykthos, because it changes Omen Hawker's mana from being narrow in that it can only activate abilities to being universal. And then also Nykthos always needs an input of 2 mana at the beginning. This is literally the most efficient way to do it, right? I don't think there's any card in any format that for 1 mana produces 2 mana that you can use to activate your Nykthos. So, and it hangs around and gives you a devotion pip, which is great.
Yeah, we like to say that it taps for 3 with Nykthos.
It does. Yeah, that's actually, kind of interesting. Although you're kind of down a land. So it's like the Omen Hawker plus the Nykthos tap for 3.
All right, so let's talk about those decks, because this was one of the areas we were most excited for. A friend of the show, LAA11, had written this amazing primer on how to build Blue Devotion decks, and he was testing his own versions of Mono Blue Devotion with Omen Hawker in the Discord, and I think eventually got his list to a place that he liked. I see a lot of parallels to what you played, Zach, so why don't you talk us through how you built these decks?
Yeah. I personally was interested in a lot of the combo angles that he talked about. So one of the big things you want to do in any format, and David likes to talk about this, is make sure that your deck is not like a worse version overall than something else exists, or maybe that's Mord's go-to. One of the things I was pointing out to someone who was coming in and talking while we were playing the Mono Blue Devotion deck is that there already exists a Devotion deck that's very, very good in Pioneer, of course, the Mono Green Devotion deck. So the question is, what do you do that is different than the Mono Green deck? One of the most important things is to have some stack interaction. There's copies of Make Disappear in here. One of the other things is to have a combo kill. Now, the Mono Green Devotion deck has a combo kill. This one does as well, but the one that I was taking advantage of was Wizard class plus Benthic Biomancer alongside Thassa's Oracle. So that's a you win the game combo that is assisted by both Omen Hawker and Training Grounds. Not so much Training Grounds in that particular combo, but Training Grounds folds into the rest of the deck in a really powerful way. I would say La 1-1 was more willing to play cards that are like blanket powerful cards that don't synergize in any way with what you're doing, although I guess they synergize with themselves. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about Risen Reef and Master of Waves. That was in the Blue Devotion deck that I have here in front of me. That's just a combination of cards, even Master of Waves on its own, that I'm just like not interested in. Personally, it just didn't fit anything with the style that I was looking to do here. So I just iterated twice through these decks. I thought they were really, really strong. The most powerful thing that I found was playing a Reality Chip. So Reality Chip is that Future Sight effect once it's equipped to one of your creatures. And both Omen Hawker and Training Grounds make this very cheap to equip. It gets around the Training Grounds being awkward sometimes with the fact that Reality Chip comes in as a creature and it equips as a creature. So it is reduced by Training Grounds. And playing Reality Chip with this deck was incredibly powerful. The other two cards I really liked with Training Grounds in particular are Spectral Sailor and Hypnotic Grifter. You can see by the second iteration of this deck, I went up to 3 Hypnotic Grifters. But Hypnotic Grifter has a 3 generic mana ability to connive. It's a 1/2 for 1 mana. And so when you have a Training Grounds, that becomes 1 mana connive, which is really good. And Spectral Sailor, of course, can be 1 and a blue to draw a card if you have a Training Grounds, or even just blue, draw a card if you have 2. So those are just like great little cogs in these machines that you're going to see in a lot of the decks I built, because if you're playing Training Grounds, that really seemed to be one of the most powerful sort of like low investment cards that could be great glue.
Yeah, so how did you find the Wizard class combo? Right, this is a card that is actually buffed on Alchemy. Like they felt like Wizard class was just too expensive, and they made it 2 mana cheaper on Magic Arena.
Oh, like the 3rd chapter?
They did, yeah. So they feel like they got it wrong when they priced Wizard class. So did you feel that, like when you were playing this, did you feel like, Wizard class, this is just like a...
Not so much. I will say that the 3rd chapter like didn't come up outside of comboing very much at all. But I think that's just indicative of the Pioneer format. Like, if you want to care about creature size, then the decks who do that are just going to do that so much better than you. And it is like a 5-mana investment, so you can't just do it like flippantly, right? You don't have a lot of situations where you could just do that. A lot of the times when I lost, it would be like just very, very close situations where I could either dig deeper through my deck or spend the 5 on the wizard class, but not necessarily both. So maybe it being a little cheaper would have helped me in a couple of cases, but overall it felt fine. And Omen Hawker was, of course, a big help in assembling that, as was the reality chip.
Did you find that you were able to interact successfully with your opponents, or did you find that you were more just like racing to churn through your deck, get your engine set up, and find your combo?
I felt like the first version I played was a little bit more successful, even though it kind of had some clunkier cards in it. And the second version, I cut down on interaction to kind of make the engine more powerful. And I think just that little helping of like make disappears and brazen borrowers really did a lot to let this deck be successful in the way that it was trying to be.
And I guess the third main difference between what you played and what LAA11 played is he was very high on Jorian. I think he felt like through all his iterations, felt like you must have 80 cards just because Nykthos, A, gives you something to do with all that Nykthos mana, and B, some of the attractive Nykthos setup cards can be cards that reset. So he's playing Witching Wells, 4 copies, Omen of the Sea. I don't believe he's playing Wizard class in his final version. I know he messed around with that, but that would be another card that you could reset for value. So that's part of it, and then that in turn makes the Risen Reef Master of Waves package more attractive. I mean, look, Risen Reef is the only green card in the entire deck.
Yep.
It's that powerful, that important to like the end game that we're trying to set up in LAA11's version, where Master of Waves gives you an elemental for each Blue Devotion pip. If the Risen Reef isn't played, that's just like so many cards.
Yeah, my feeling was that I was building combo decks, and not ones that had the world's greatest, like real mid-range game plan. So Jorian just basically was never a consideration for me. So I literally couldn't tell you if it would have been beneficial or not in my construction. In fact, there are probably a few decks that I'll get to later where maybe the next level is to iterate them into Jorian decks because they may benefit from that. There was definitely certain cards that I was interested in testing that I just kind of never could find room for.
Interesting. Well, should we go to those decks now, or do you have more that you want to add about?
No, the Blue Devotion was sort of, I wanted to cover that quickly, actually. We spent a little bit more time on it than my personal iterating and testing was, but I'm glad that I got to see LAA11's specific list, etc. By the way, writer, listener, patron, please tell us how you expect us to say your name, because we've been all over the place with this. It's really, really starting to annoy me. So the other thing that was brought up to us, so one of the first versions of any of these decks that I played had Omen Hawker, and it had Omen Hawker in Training Grounds, and it had like some Reckoner Bankbusters. It had that Adaptive Automaton. It was a list that David put together, and
Patchwork Automaton,
thank you. And it just had a bunch of ideas that, to me, really, really didn't work, and Omen Hawker was a complete flop in that deck. But I think one of the things that was in that deck was the idea of this Drafna combo. So I've written quite a chunk here in our show notes about different Drafna combo decks. Either you're doubling up by playing Drafna combo alongside Rona combo, and I iterated a bunch on these decks. I had endless fun playing these. So the combo we're talking about here is Mox Amber plus Drafna, founder of Latinam, plus Training Grounds. Drafna, founder of Latinam, for those who do not remember, is 1 and a blue for a legendary creature, Human Artificer Advisor. Is an ability that's 1 and a blue, return target artifact you control to its owner's hand, and is 3 generic tap ability, copy target artifact spell you control. The copy becomes a token. So with Drafna, Training Grounds, and Mox Amber, you have infinite artifact casts and infinite artifact entering the battlefield triggers. And the reason that matched up well with the Automaton was then you have an infinitely sized creature with Ward 2. I just felt like the automaton was like not a great card in general. It was one of those things, again, if you want to have like a threat like that in this format, the decks that are interested in interacting on that level are just going to be bigger and better than you for the most part. And if you're trying to kill people with it, it's just not good enough. But there is...
Right, it doesn't actually kill them. They can just block.
Right, exactly.
And it's summoning sick. So
yeah, and we had like ways to get around that, like in theory. Both those things are solvable, right? But having to solve them is just another hurdle, and it's like, well, what if we just played something along the lines of Altar of the Brood? So that's a 1-mana artifact that says whenever an artifact enters the battlefield... Sorry, another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent mills a card. We just mill people out with that. And fairly quickly after that, I had the realization that Kinnan Bonder Prodigy can replace Training Grounds in this combo. But also, if you get both a Training Grounds and a Kinnan, something interesting happens. Now your Mox Amber produces infinite mana. And Kinnan has an activated ability right there written on the card that allows you to, with infinite mana, flip every single non-creature in your deck into play. If that includes at least one copy of a card I mentioned earlier, Spectral Sailor, you can now draw your entire deck and kill your opponent with anything you want. On Magic Online, it saves time to have something efficient to do it with, but that's not necessary. Like in paper, you could just, iterate infinitely there and do that. So once I realized all this was going on and that Rona, the Rona combo with Retraction Helix works with Mox Amber in a sort of similar way, I built this Sultai list here at the bottom with Tyvar Jubilant Brawler as a way to bring back any of your 2-drop creatures who were killed at any point. So you have Rona, Drafna, Kinnan, and then Training Grounds and all sorts of little artifacts. Springleaf Drum, of course, great with Kinnan, helps fix your colors for all the, anything that you need to be doing here, and helps you accelerate and just sort of vomit out a big board of stuff. Oftentimes, all these things team up to give you a bunch of mana to activate Spectral Sailor to dig to your combo pieces. And this was reasonably successful in that version, and so then I spun that up to the version you'll see above it, which is just a Simic version, not playing Tyvar anymore, because Tyvar actually didn't seem necessary at all. And I love playing Hullbreaker, Horror, Kinnan, Mox Amber. I don't remember the original way that we arrived at that, Dan. I think you tried it in Modern, and you were having problems like clicking through the combo, and so I brought it to Pioneer, playing like a Simic Kinnan mana ramp deck that vomited out Hullbreaker Horrors and tried to go infinite with like Mox Ambers and Ornithopters.
That was from our Hullbreaker Horror week.
Yes.
Because you and Emmy were like, this is the card. This is the card.
And I still love it. I still love my Lobster Monster.
Right. So it's interesting because, back then I was trying to solve the issue of how do we ever get the 7-drop into play. We had Man Elves in there. I think at one point Dollhouse of Horrors was used to try to get Hullbreakers into play. Here, now we have Tyvar, who works so great with Mana Elves, right? Because every time you get to untap a Mana Elf and tap it again, the Mana Elf has haste, right? Tyvar is perfect there. But instead, like, Tyvar's best role, it turns out, is actually not generating mana or anything like that. It's just rebuying Rona, rebuying these combo pieces. You can see like why it's there. Like, it makes total sense that you try the Sultai version, but I also see how, like, outside of exactly bringing back Rona, it doesn't really do anything good for you. Rona's the only card in the deck that taps. So.
Right, and so Patchwork Crawler can substitute really nicely, right? As a way to take advantage of creatures who are in your graveyard that you want to use. Now, it doesn't let you take advantage of Kinnan's static text, so if that's what you're looking to grab, it doesn't help you for that. But there may be even more things that kind of help this deck be better than even I have put together so far.
So it's interesting that you're playing 3 copies of your win condition. That's Altar of the Brood. Now, I know you started with like Karn the Great Creator.
Yes.
As one of your ways to like find the win condition. But did you just find that it was just taking too long to get Karn and do all these things and just added a lot of mana to the combo?
Yeah. Basically, that's what it was. Is like Karn just felt medium minus in the version that I tried it in. It may be better than I think it is. Of note, other cards that worked their way in and out with the number of copies I was playing was a Moonsnare Prototype. Moonsnare Prototype is an interesting way to generate extra mana with Kinnan, but unfortunately in this particular version there was just so few ways to use that colorless mana that it just felt like I didn't want to play too many copies of that card, even though it is kind of it's a pretty good card. And I even had this version that you're looking at here has 3 Nykthos hanging out in the mana base, just because you often do put together a pretty reasonable number of devotion pips. But I don't. There's just a lot of candidates for a deck like this, and a lot of slots to kind of fill out your engine and then make sure your combo is redundant enough. Without Tyvar, now Rona can't have haste, so it is one of those things of like, well, maybe there's a good version of this that doesn't play Rona and Retraction Helix, because that doesn't actually feed into the rest of the deck all that powerfully. I'm not sure how to solve that. I didn't get to any conclusion in that way yet.
So here's a question for you. One thing that I thought might happen is that because you're playing Training Grounds, possibly Omen Hawker, but I see you've cut it here, you have access to the backside of Rona at a much cheaper rate than most Rona decks do. Right? Rona can be transformed by paying 5 and a Phyrexian. So if you pay 2 life, you just need 5 mana to flip Rona. If you have a Training Grounds, it's 3 mana. If you have 2 Training Grounds, it's 1 mana. And then you get this, I don't know what you would call this, like a Obliterator type creature?
Yeah, Phyrexian Obliterator.
Extremely powerful. It has trample. It gets card advantage every time they try to block. Did you find that was coming up frequently, or was that just not what Rona was for?
It's just not what this deck was about in any way. There was like a couple times where I kind of flipped it and tried to go aggro with Rona, and it was just unclear whether or not that was more useful than just using Rona to rummage every turn. The number of legendary spells in this deck meant that Rona could often loot 2 or 3 times in a turn, and when you were looking to combo, that is definitely something that I leaned on the side of, rather than trying to just like flip it into random beatdown. There was a couple of games where without going infinite at all, I was just able to like cast a Hullbreaker Horror and a couple of spells and just flip my opponent's board back to their hand. So it's an interesting thing of like, the more Hullbreaker Horrors you put in this deck, the more you can discard them to Rona and use that as a filtering. Or in this case, maybe Hypnotic Grifters, so that they're not like these dead giant clunky combo pieces. That's something that, again, I didn't quite solve.
Did Drafna do anything for you besides combo? Did you ever use Drafna's other abilities?
In a previous version of this deck that had Reckoner Bankbuster, once I copied a Reckoner Bankbuster, so that was pretty cool. But other than that, not typically. No. Drafna's 3 generic ability to copy an artifact didn't really come up much. I can't think of too many times where it will. I think maybe I copied a Springleaf Drum once, but it was just because I could, rather than actually particularly contributing in any way.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So of the combos that you were trying here, you had the Rona Mox Amber Retraction Helix combo. You had the Drafna Mox Amber Training Grounds plus a kill piece. You paired them together. You've tried them separately. Like, which one is stronger? Which one is like the core of the deck?
Well, in this case, it's the one I was killing people with much more often was the Drafna combo. But I think part of that was that once people were aware it was a Rona deck, they weren't necessarily ready for a different combo to kill them out of nowhere. So because people would spend a lot of time like trying to solve my Ronas in any deck list that it's in, because they're aware that the Rona combo exists, and they're not necessarily aware that the Drafna combo exists. I will say, in terms of pure ceiling, you've seen this clip, and I did throw it somewhere in these notes, but I did get a turn 2 kill with one of these decks, which was pretty ludicrous. But it was just so funny to see that my opponent was playing some kind of like 5-color Bring to Light Niv Mizzet deck, and their only play in that entire game was a Triome.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was pretty great. Didn't even know it was possible. And if you watch the clip, I'm sitting there going like, this is a turn 3 kill. I'm going to keep this hand. And then it's turn 2. And I go, I think I could just kill them here. Yeah.
Right. So you need Drafna, you need Training Grounds.
Yeah, you need 2 Mox Ambers.
Altar of the Brood. Yeah. Exactly. The second Mox Amber gets you there.
Yeah, 2 Mox Amber. The second Mox Amber was what I needed to make it a one shot. Still, that's a if you want to play a combo deck, I would say having that kind of ceiling is never a bad thing.
All right, Zach, so you played a bunch of leagues with numerous versions. What were your results, and like what would you recommend to people if they were interested in trying this?
Well, that's where we kind of falls apart a little bit. I don't remember anything being better than a 3-2, and I literally couldn't name you. I think it was the Sultai Drafna deck playing Tyvar. That was the 3-2. Most of the others were 2-3s, a couple of 1-4s with the Devotion deck. So as far as power and ability to line up against the Pioneer format, I'm not sure which one of these is quite there. So if you want something that I feel confident is powerful and can be worked on, I would say that the Simic Drafna deck with the Hullbreaker Horrors, that's a great place to start, in my opinion. Gut it, change it in any way you want. I just think the core of playing Kinnan, Drafna, Training Grounds, Mox Amber, that package there and whatever engine you can build around it has some real promise. Reality Chip is one of the most powerful things to team up with them, but I'm not 100% sure that you need to. Spectral Sailor and Hypnotic Grifter both team up with this really nicely as well. If you are going to play the Kinnan Training Ground Drafna combo, make sure that you have at least one copy of Spectral Sailor in your deck somewhere, or another non-human that you can use to immediately combo off. Hullbreaker Horror works too. So these are all considerations, and this is in my opinion, like it's just something to sit on as like, I know these pieces exist together, and figuring out the best way to create the next combo deck is going to be an interesting question. Much the same as, David for a long time had this, Lotus Field, Discontinuity, Stern Proctor kind of combination of cards that he was working on in different shells. And all of a sudden someone comes along and says, well, I built a blue-white mid-range deck, and it is one of the best ways to do that.
Exactly. So maybe that's the last thing we want to touch on in this episode is David also tried out the Omen Hawker concept, and he was doing it in blue-white with Lotus Field. Now, it's not the package that Zach just described. Right? We've done all that. We've sent many tickets to their deaths trying to make Stern Proctor happen. I wasted a lot of Pro Tour testing time trying to make that happen in Historic. So that's not what this deck is. This deck is trying to get Lotus Field into play, but doing that with the help of Omen Hawker. Well, how does that work? Well, in theory, you can play the Lotus Field, cycle Nimble Obstructionist, use Omen Hawker to pay for the cycling. In theory. In practice, that's just not what Nimble Obstructionist actually does. We just didn't read the card closely enough. So we apologize to anyone who rushed out to buy this deck and put 4 Nimble Obstructionist in their Lotus Field deck. Don't do it. Doesn't work. Nimble Obstructionist only counters the opponent's abilities. Only the opponent's abilities. So that was a bit of a miss on our part. However, the rest of the deck was sound in concept, right? So what the rest of the deck is blue-white control. It's hoping to eventually get the Lotus Field into play, which means that you have a big mana angle. And one of the best things to do with a lot of mana is resolve Teferi 5. That's Teferi Hero Dominaria. Resolve Shark Typhoons. Just tap your Lotus Field for a 3-mana counterspell. Neutralize, in this case, it's effortless when you have the Lotus Field going. The problem is that when you don't have the Lotus Field going, you just have these clunkers, right? Turn 2 Cycle Shark Typhoon is a laughable play. And, any Shark Typhoon deck has to just make that play a bunch of times. If you put Omen Hawker into the mix, all this becomes a lot more attractive, right? Turn 2 Shark Typhoon, but you get a 2/2 Shark out of it is a lot more attractive. Turn 2 Cycle and Neutralize and still have 2 mana left over for a Censor or a Dovin's Veto or for playing a Reckoner Bankbuster. Yeah, that's actually pretty good. The idea of putting Omen Hawker and 4 copies of Reckoner Bankbuster into this kind of big mana blue-white control deck, I think it still had some promise even despite the miss on the Nimble Obstructionist. That being said, when David actually went and tested this, he lost every match. Says here in the notes that he went 0-4. All the matches were close. He lost, in 3 games every time. Played against Rakdos, played against Mono Blue Spirits, played against a mid-range Mardu, Jorian Pile, and Boros Convoke. So kind of a range of aggro and attrition. And, in each case, his deck almost got there, but just fell a little bit short. I think he says here that at some point you are what your record says you are. So maybe that's just not going to work, right? I think the problem is that Omen Hawker is a very attractive target for removal, and you're suddenly just like opening up like a new line of attack, right? You made the removal good, you've slowed yourself down, you become easy to disrupt.
Yeah, I want to reiterate that was one of the first things that happened with me with cutting Omen Hawker out of a lot of the decks that I was working on, and I really like the combination of Training Grounds and like Spectral Sailor, for example, is like very specifically like those two cards together. I really thought were kind of great because you have this 1 mana flash creature, you can sneak it in sometimes and start drawing cards for 2 mana, and that's a very aggressive rate in a lot of situations, right? But I will say, like, when I see something like this and a result like this, and you had that a good statement of like sometimes you are what your record says you are, but with everything being a 1/2, I'm like, well, maybe you were closer than you thought you were. Maybe this deck needs to borrow from his other technology. Just put 4 Stern Proctors in here somewhere, right? We've got room with cutting the Nimble Obstructionists, and it's just generally a reasonable card in the metagame that teams up with your Lotus Fields.
Right, so Reckoner Bankbuster, right, that was the other 4 of to make the Omen Hawkers good. David found that it's actually only really good against specifically Rakdos, and it's kind of a liability against everything else, even when you're drawing cards off Omen Hawker. So in that sense, he felt like, this package of Hawker plus Bankbuster, maybe you just can't play it in a blue-white. He actually suggested maybe you need to pair that with black, to have efficient interaction, Thoughtseize Fatal Push, and indeed, Pascal Maynard, who kind of set us down this path, posted a very similar in concept, blue-black with Omen Hawker, with Fatal Push, with Reckoner Bankbuster, as a deck that he was testing for the Canadian Regional Championships.
I think I saw him playing at a side event also after he scrubbed out of the main, but as so many talented players did. But this is a great deck to look at. One thing I will comment on Reckoner Bankbuster, because I love Reckoner Bankbuster very, very much. It's like a much more let's say aggressive Mazemind Tome, but it's not the end all be all of cards that just like is great in any grindy setup. It's a lot of mana, and Omen Hawker does help with that, but it's like it can just be like a very clunky slow draw. So that's why you're going to see like it disappeared mostly from a lot of my lists, is that if you can't consistently just crew it, and if you're not interested in beating your opponent to death, then it's actually a lot less good. The number of times I've watched Rakdos decks just get free value out of Reckoner Bankbuster just sitting around on the table, and they're like, oh, I played a Bone Crusher Giant this turn and I can crew it and attack. Like, I think that's actually pretty integral to Bankbuster being successful. The fact that it eventually crews itself isn't good enough in the average matchup.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, and in fact, the Is It Drake's deck that I played just last weekend that put 2 people into the top 8 of a Pioneer Challenge very recently was playing 3 copies of Mazemind Tome in the sideboard, no copies of Reckoner Bankbuster in the 75. Someone who saw me playing the deck and sideboarding those in went, whoa, what happened? The Bankbuster's in the shop? And I was like, well... Actually, that's an interesting question, and I kind of got to think about it more. So Mazemind Tome can be a great option for certain types of decks, especially if you're not likely to be able to crew a Bankbuster on its own. Don't discard these things just because it's good in a popular deck. Sometimes there's a very good reason why it's good in a popular deck, and why a different deck might want a very different card, or a similar card that is distinctly different.
Yeah, exactly. And don't discard packages just because we haven't found the right shell yet. Like, exactly like Zach was saying, that Stern Proctor Lotus Field thing, we've been puttering around with that and mostly failing forever. And now suddenly it's the breakout deck, right? That deck ran the tables at the Canadian Regional Championship. I think it was a top seed after the Swiss.
That's right.
And then that same weekend, his deck won the Pioneer Showcase Challenge. It's like a kind of brilliant construction, actually. Took out all the counter magic. That was like the big level up, is like you're enabling Lotus Field. He described it almost like a Tron deck. Like you're just trying to set up your Lotus Field Tron mana base.
Correct.
And Doomscar turned out to be the big upgrade there, because you're not really doing anything on turn 2, so you might as well just foretell that. And then Doomscar kind of makes up for like not having counter magic in the first game. So you become like this tap out mid-range ramp deck that is easy to mistake for control. But if you look closely, actually, he's just figuring out that I'm actually not good at leaving counter magic mana up when I'm also trying to play Lotus Field. So, yeah, great improvements. Great job by Patrick Wu discovering that, and also just like a lesson for brewers that, don't give up on something that's promising just because, it hasn't worked for a year. Doesn't mean it's not something powerful there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So with all of these delightful synergies and explorations behind us, I know I'm looking towards a bright future where we will have some Invasion of Gobakhan results. And we also do, for anyone who's still waiting on them, we do have some Chrome Host Seed Shark results. But Dan, I think we're going to skip over these for today. Or do you want to hit those on?
No, I was playing it in Modern, so let's save that for our next show, which I think will be more about Modern. As we dip into Lord of the Rings.
And I will say I've faced down a Chrome Host Seed Shark in Pioneer a couple times, backed up by Leyline bindings. It's a great combo, just as you guys prophesied, as you thought it might be. Although I was able to overpower it with the Chandra turn stack, it was a close thing.
Seed Shark gets a bad rep, but I'll have more to say about that next time.
Absolutely.
All right, Zach, thanks very much.
Oh, thanks for having me. Thanks for inspiring me. And everybody else out there, you can always get in touch with us. The Faithless Brewing Twitter. You can hang out at twitch.com/manasymbol. Yes, .com. I'll always say .com. I don't care. It works. So type it into your search bar and you'll get to where you're trying to go.
Exactly. All right. Take care, Zach. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Faithless Brewing. If you enjoyed this program, you can join our family at patreon.com/faithlessbrewing. Your contributions help us bring you freshly brewed episodes every week, but they'll get you Discord access, show note access, merch, and so much more. That's all for today. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
What's a battle?